Hi. Before I begin, I would like to honor and recognize the presence of indigenous lands and people and their relationship to lands, since we are all coming from somewhere and allowed to walk on and live in the indigenous land. The collaborative student projects I am introducing coming from AD 597 Land Politics and Art Inquiry I teach and I developed. The class provides a space for critical dialogue on unattended, unheard place stories of indigenous Black refugee and historically underrepresented community, as well as non-human inhabitants, and rethinking and expanding conceptual and our educational approach to the social ecological equity. Through engaging in the critique of settler colonial practice, students learn to acknowledge, honor, and learn from examples of the indigenous land caretakers. They learn to care for the land through centering on decolonizing anti-racist approaches to understandings of our land in response to the settler colonial imperatives. The students participated in a process of artistic research that prompted critical reflections on their positionalities and ethical practice and prompted them to engage with a real-world location as a politically charged, unjust space and environment for equity. So basically, our pedagogical directions, which is more focused on inquiry-based art in action rather than just the mind. And then also next was, decolonizing approach to our art projects, especially we do engage in a lot of settler colonial critique on place and land. And last one is we also focus on ethical approaches. More of us, we all mostly of our students are settlers, white settlers, and immigrant settlers of color, and we take on the more reflexive self-critique on our own positionality, which is really lead to the more ethical approach to the land and ethical relationship with the land to establish since we arrived here. So first the projects I wanted to introduce, I'm not sure we have enough time, but the Leather Park Placards project, which is 3 students collaborative site-specific public art event drawing on land-based art inquiries to uncover stories of a public place. Leather Park, a site where one student participant regularly walked her dog, commanded the group's attention, in part because it featured one of the State College's few public sculptural monuments. A statue of the park's namesake, Lucy Lederer, and 22 more modest monuments that are small bronze placards dedicating trees to various State College residents. All of these placards feature the white settlers' names. The quiet ubiquity of these placards in the park and the way they move through thoroughly claimed the land for white settlers' culture activated connections to indigenous critical race and post-human attitudes toward the land for the student participants. The student participants' research inquiry centered on the question on the stories of the land before the construction of the park, in what ways the land was converted to a public park, and for what purposes the land has been converted to a public park. Lastly, how Leather Park materializes the settler colonial stories and habits and erases and replaces indigenous stories of the place. This focus of inquiry was refined and developed over the course of a sustained critical engagement with and reflection upon the students' chosen setting of Leather Park. It led to a development of a land-based art intervention in the Leather Park by creating alternative placards to disrupt the settler colonial environment. So here, these are the previous, the previous one is the Lucy Lederer statues, which is a commemorate of this land, which is we couldn't find we traced actually the history of this place, but we couldn't find the before settlers families purchased this land. And then these are the original placards. And then we actually kind of designed the 22 placards replacement with the new narratives, and which is sometimes challenging, sometimes a certain direction for audiences to follow, but mostly kind of a disruption attitude. So disrupted to this settler colonial imperatives in the park. The written prompts were developed, they were laser etched into the biodegradable wood panels. And these are the kind of designs we had for the 22 placards, and then turn it into this way. So this is one of the ways to we acknowledge the indigenous people inhabited in this land before loose leather. I want you to just, read what the content is usually we created, student created. Through the creation of a new placards, the student participants explored how varied the theoretical frames may decenter or dismantle the European planetary consciousness materially manifested in the public park. Such frames included decolonizing frames to unsettle settler colonizers' assumptions, critical race frames to highlight the endemic and tacit claims of a white property which maintain racial injustice, and post-human materialist attempts to decenter and dissolve the anthropocentric liberal assumptions that underpin European planetary consciousness. So here we discussed that particularly when we investigating this site, and the public park, often as a Western European construction, has been a very familiar, approachable public space in a daily lives. But Popular Association of Public Parks with ideas of democracy, health, and the natural world contrast sharply with the decolonial analysis of public parks, which reveals the settled colonial possessive logic that underlies parks as a public property. Common understanding of public parks rarely inquire into the stories of the land before the construction of the park. So we questions in what ways the land was converted to a public park, and for what purposes the land has been converted to a public park. These are our major inquiries, and also, keep between the theories and also our particular sites to develop this art in action. So next project is next group. This is I actually involved with this group together. We create the Listening to Indigenous Instagram archive. This project is studied from our investigation of Penn State as a U.S. land grant university. And we inquired and discussed how we engage in the history of the land we inhabit at a land grant university, and move broadly as a residents within the United States, a settler nation. Our critical assessment, including self-critique, took place through the probing what constitutes a land grant university, what unnoticed stories and social and environmental contexts are behind the name of a land grant university, and how we use art or media in action to interrupt the settler colonial environment and habits. And This one, especially Instagram archive, is designed to amplify contemporary indigenous experience, art, environment, knowledge, and lives, and to direct students at Pennsylvania State University to engage more deeply in indigenous knowledge and perspectives. So we walk into the campus, we often see mostly kind of settler colonial habits and materialities. And then that was our conscious move into the more critical investigation and understanding. And we also found out how we are in academia so much engaged with the Western knowledge and connections and perspectives. We try to kind of bring into center on indigenous knowledge and perspectives through these projects to address that. We are dealing with the land, but however, we also kind of more going into the what the knowledge, what is the fundamental kind of issues, maybe ecology, and also kind of a land is another surface level, but which is kind of going into the what's the issues, because indigenous land is nature is their life, land is their life. It's not dissociate concept. It's very close concept for their lives. So for the project, we chose a face mask, first of all, as our medium because they are relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic, but they serve as a symbolic silencing of the colonizers' voices in exchange for the indigenous voices. So the phrase and design, which the mask bears, serves as an invitation to non-indigenous to engage with indigenous knowledge and settler colonial critique. So what students think, the simple headphone encircling the quad and the physical covering the wearer's mouth reminds the wearer and viewer of the need to step back and listen to indigenous voices. We designed the mask to physically also intervene in the space of the campus with an indigenous-centered understanding of land. We employed indigenous scholar Megan Banks' catchphrase, "Land is, therefore we are," demonstrating indigenous people's interconnection with the land. The praise is parodied from Descartes' famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." The praise taught us to refuse a place-based paradigm, which centers settlers, humans, and overlooks the indigenous sovereignty and presence in the land. Instead, we learn to take up a land-based paradigm by decentering the human, reminding us of the interdependence of living and non-living and human and non-human. So through the praise, we seek to remind the Penn State residents of indigenous sovereignty and presence in the land and the necessity of changing their role and responsibility to the land. So this our attempts to the physical disruption through the mask extends to the disruption in the digital landscape through the listening to the indigenous Instagram archive, which has a broader focus than the mask by centering the voice of multitudes of indigenous people, scholars, educators, artists, and activists. The archive acts as digital disruption to Penn State student users' Instagram feed, as every click, follow, and like of listening to indigenous content will shift their algorithms. With a total of 62 followers and over 300 interactions and counting, every interaction is another exposure to indigenous voices and higher probability to be connected to more learning based on suggested content, hashtag, account tags, and explorer feeds. By amplifying indigenous voices on the account, we question dominant European settler-based paradigms of what is considered the legitimate knowledge and encourage engagement with indigenous knowledge. The Instagram handle of the digital archive conveys our project's position intention. We are not indigenous. This is not our land. The content on this account is not our own, but comes from indigenous scholars, artists, curators, advocates that were gathered to form a digital archive. So we cautiously approached our selection and reposing by prioritizing to highlight indigenous peoples from a variety of tribes. Yet in reflection, we acknowledge that the shared posts were not or encompassing of every indigenous experience and perspective. Through each of the shares and reposts, our intention is to amplify indigenous perspectives and knowledge, to encourage listening by non-indigenous people, and to critique the settler colonial imperatives deeply saturated in our everyday needs, which greatly mutes the past, present, future of indigenous presence. So we chose to disrupt a space highly trafficked by students and distribute the mask at the main entrance in the Robinson Hub during the final week. Throughout the distribution, we saw a mixture of responses from eager to curious. Some seemed to already have some understanding of the topic and were eager to know more, while others seemed unaware but were curious to learn. We have seen how our participation and engagement with indigenous peoples through social media has led to a disruption of the algorithms that dictates our interest in our own personal social media accounts. At the very least, in seeking to critique settler colonialism, we attempt to disrupt our own knowledge and habits. Thank you for our collaborative projects to listen here. I'm not sure, this is the posters. Actually, I skipped very briefly. And this is the Instagrams for some screenshots. And then this is the day, we went out to the hub and to provide the mask and also give our QR code for them to actually check this site to join. So in that way, our feed is keep continuing. And this is still ongoing work, probably never ending, hopefully not. Yes, do you have any comments and questions? Thank you for listening to my presentation.